Next, we have a lab focus. This is M. Wu and Keith Gordon from Northwestern University.
Thanks. It's the Human Agility Lab. So I'm going to talk about a study that I'm just working on analyzing right now, and I want to raise a lot of questions and have discussions with people about the different methods here. So I want to start with some problematic definitions. First of all, locomotor stability. People have talked about it in very different ways at this conference. Some people are just referring to avoiding falls. Other people are talking about disturbance rejection in the sense of orbital stability and boundedness, and assumes a steady state. But the definition I'd like to get people more interested in is a whole body mechanical impedance. And that's just the relationship of forces and motions that are externally imposed versus what motions and forces are generated by the body. And we can get away from steady state here. So I'm going to talk about these lateral maneuvers that we've done in an experiment, and then I'm going to define a maneuver as a change in locomotion direction or velocity, or a transition between periodic gait patterns. So our large overarching question is there a trade-off in lateral maneuvers between stability and performance? And I'm going to use these words, stability and performance, even though they're more like heuristic devices. And in the back of your head, I really want you to think about these ideas of robustness and impedance. And then on the other end, maybe responsiveness and bandwidth of your system, and this tricky idea of maneuverability. So for our hypothesis, we thought that priming people in haptic force fields will alter their stability and their maneuver performance. We're quantifying stability by the margin of stability, also known as capture point, and step width. Performance, we're looking at time and the number of steps to complete the maneuver. And we thought that if we prime people in different types of fields, it'll result in different trade-offs between stability and performance. So this is one type of force field we're using. It's a damping field where forces resist your lateral velocity. There's a cable-driven robot that's hooked up laterally to people's pelvises as they're walking on a treadmill. And we think there's going to be decreased effort from the participant to maintain straight ahead walking here. And then we have the opposite field, which is negative damping, and the forces amplify their lateral velocity, and then it requires increased effort to maintain straight ahead walking. So all of this is happening in priming. They're just walking straight. And afterwards, we ask them to make lateral maneuvers, and I think that they're going to have very different trade-offs between stability and performance depending on the type of field. So I'm going to show you a video of a person with a spinal cord injury. We did this also in people who are not impaired. The task is that she's walking with visual feedback of her center of mass position in this white line. Let's see if you can. Sorry. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, I think you can kind of see the white line that's her center of mass, and she's trying to keep it between this green lane, and that lane adjusts in width depending on the level of challenge. So if she's really good at it, it's going to get narrower, and if she's making a lot of errors, it's going to get wider. So we wanted to do this to make sure people are actually being challenged in their stability. So I'm just going to show you, this is what her baseline walking looks like in a null field. You can see it's kind of slow, it looks kind of rigid. And then we have her doing the same task in a damping field, and the lane is really narrow here. It's much easier for her to stabilize her center of mass. And then in the negative damping field, it's very difficult for her to accomplish this task. So that was the first part of the protocol. The second part, we're asking them to perform a lateral maneuver from one lane to another, and here it's a fixed lane width for all three conditions. So this is her baseline lateral maneuver. You can see it takes her several steps. She doesn't look very dynamic as she's doing it. And you want to compare that to what happens after the damping field. She makes it like almost a crossover step. It's a very dynamic movement. And then after the negative damping field, she has her center of mass even more within her base of support. So when I look at the data and the results, the stability of the maneuver does change with priming. I see this trend of higher margin of stability after the negative damping field, where she was really stiff, and I showed you with lots of steps, and that was significant, I see towards a trend of lower stability, or smaller minimum margin stability after the damping field, but it wasn't significant. I see the same trend in step width, and all those changes are significant. But performance remained the same. So maneuver time, we didn't see any significant differences, or the number of steps it took to do the maneuver. This is over all of the subjects. I showed you one subject who has a very strong effect. So we were wrong. There was no trade-off between stability and performance. So then I needed to back up and see if we're looking at the right metrics. And I have this question about what is stability in the context of a maneuver. Sometimes you want high impedance, like maybe when you're terminating a maneuver, but during the transport phase of a maneuver, you might want low impedance. And also, we talk about disturbance rejection for stability, but what if the disturbance assists you in the direction you're trying to go? Then you might want to use admittance control. So then there's an idea of some people just care about completing the task, no matter what. Doesn't matter the speed or the trajectory. I mean, we told them to do it as fast as possible, but no matter what, some people just didn't care. So I think that's better summed up by this idea of robustness. How repeatable can you accomplish this task? And also, I think we need much more complex performance metrics, something I'm going to call range, just the number of available movement patterns in your repertoire, different strategies of how to execute this. You could do a sidestep, a crossover step, etc. And also, I want to train people to be flexible so they can shift between these different movement patterns for different contexts. And that's more related to the idea of responsiveness or bandwidth. And lastly, I'd really like to train people how to be more efficient. So they may have their own utility function where they value speed or robustness or safety or whatever, and then cost, what they tend to favor more, like saving metabolic energy or cognitive load. And I just want to teach them how to get the most bang for their buck. So an important thing to remember, though, is that the utility and cost functions depend on the context, the environment, and the task. So the type of damping field, but also the task we're asking them to do, and the person's preferences. So the method I'm interested in is how do we manipulate the context in order to get them to shift their preferences and their cost and utility functions. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll continue with talking about another study from our lab. To put it mildly, after incomplete spinal cord injury, people's ability to walk can be significantly impaired. Fortunately, right, we know the nervous system is plastic, and that with the appropriate types of physical intervention and training, we can improve walking ability. However, it's a very simple premise. However, how you actually institute an appropriate rehabilitation protocol to improve stability and this repertoire of movement skills for walking is actually quite difficult and debatable how you would best do that. So as people walk, we naturally oscillate from side to side. To create effective and efficient goal-directed walking, we need to be able to control these lateral oscillations. That can be quite difficult for an individual following incomplete spinal cord injury due to a number of reasons: weakness in the limbs and trunk, deficits in proprioception, upper body compensations to assist with limb movement. So in the last 20 years or so, we've seen huge improvements in prospects for individuals with moderate to severe incomplete spinal cord injury and their prospects for regaining independent locomotion. And this has been done through a focus on recovery rather than compensation during the rehab process. You have individuals who basically go out and very intensely practice walking either on a treadmill or over ground. And this has been shown to improve ability to walk with less assistance, improvements in speed, improvements in endurance, but stability issues persist. So 75% of ambulatory individuals with incomplete spinal cord injury will fall each year, and these residual instabilities will lead to individuals adopting cautious gait patterns that are energy inefficient and often inflexible and limit flexibility to move through an environment. So in our laboratory, often we do experiments very similar to the ones that Em did, where we're interested in understanding how individuals with incomplete spinal cord injury control locomotion, and we do that by changing the external environment and changing the walking tasks, and we're hoping that that information will then inform decisions about how we might want to actually structure interventions. So what I want to talk about here today is actually a first attempt on our part to take some of these ideas that we've seen and promising results in short-term adaptation and look at a training study. This will be a case study in an individual with incomplete spinal cord injury with the goal of trying to improve that individual's control of lateral center of mass oscillations during gait. So the intervention we want to look at is a movement amplification environment. This is the negative damping environment that Em just talked about. I'm just going to play this just to see a little bit more of a clip of what this looks like. This is in a healthy individual, again, using our robotic interface. This field, we're amplifying lateral velocity. So based on the individual's lateral velocity, we apply a force in the same direction, proportional to their velocity. And our thought is that this is a learnable environment. This is challenging lateral stability, but it's challenging in a way that's predictable. It's tied specifically to the individual's lateral motion, and that should allow learning that will allow an individual to actually make predictions about how their body's going to move. And this is more analogous to learning to control oneself or control oneself during movement as opposed to responding to a perturbation. Second, we think this type of environment could be beneficial because it'll enhance sensory feedback. Right? We've amplified the effects of movement. So for an intended motor action, you get a larger motor consequence, and we think that should help individual form a neural representation of how they interact in their environment. And finally, much like during James Finley's talk yesterday, we talked about exploration. And so this type of environment, again, we're enhancing the movement, should encourage an individual to explore their dynamic workspace. So our hypothesis is that gait training and movement amplification force field will improve control of lateral motion. And secondary to that, although we don't see it in the short term, and we didn't see it in Em's study after people were walking in this movement amplification field, is that with training, that people will be able to release their reliance on these cautious or high impedance gait strategies to control stability as they begin to learn to better control themselves. So the study set up, we brought an individual with incomplete spinal cord injury. He had residual sensory and motor control below the level of injury, but what's important, this individual was ambulatory when he came in, still had balance deficits, 16 years post-injury. He'd go to the gym and walk on his own, but he really wasn't making improvements on his own anymore. The intervention itself, we did 18 training sessions over 3 months, about two times a week. And during each training session, our goal was to do as much walking as possible in 45 minutes, and all the walking we did was done in this movement amplification environment. And so to this walking environment, we added a range of progressive training tasks that you might see in a regular physical therapy session, but now in this environment, our goals were first to increase the movement amplification gain to make it harder to control themselves. We projected walking paths on the treadmill, and those paths became progressively narrower to make it more challenging. We had them increase speed. And realistically, going into this, we didn't think we would get much further than those first 3 tasks, but he responded so well, we started including lateral maneuvers to really amplify the effects of interacting with this velocity-based field. Projecting images on a screen in front of him, so he had to take his focus of his eyes off his feet and look ahead, and began doing obstacle negotiation where we would drop beanbags on the treadmill as he stepped. Okay, so what does this look like? So I'll show, this is an individual during a pre-training session. He's walking at he'll be walking his preferred walking speed in what we consider a low movement amplification gain here. So you see a fair bit of movement. He's being asked again this is similar to the task that Em described, being asked to control his center of mass position and keep it within that yellow line. We see a large amount of movement. This is that same individual on his 11th training day, so about 5 weeks into the training. This is the visual feedback on the treadmill is no longer dynamic. It's just being projected there as a guideline for where we want him to walk. But so this is his new walking speed, and right now he's walking in that movement amplification gain, the highest gain we would do. This is the same gain that you saw the healthy individual walking with earlier. And he's pretty much dug in. I mean, to me, he looks like a pit bull. He's just kind of going for it. He's figured out how to control himself. He's able to stay right in the middle of that treadmill. You don't see those medial lateral oscillations. Walking, as I said, became too easy. Once he figured out how to walk straight, it really minimizes interaction with the field, so we began to ask him to do lateral maneuvers. So here he's doing some side-to-side maneuvers in the field. I don't have the sound up on here, but we'd yell left, right. When that sound came out, he'd then move from side to side. And so he'd figured out how to do these negotiations as well. We're projecting feedback on the screen in front of him. Okay, so what did we find? So using the dynamic lane optimization test to look at control lateral center of mass movement, see how narrow that lane could get that he could control. On the left is during the pre-test, and then post-test, he was able to walk in a 33% narrower lane. He was able to do that at both match speeds and faster speeds. So it was pretty clear to us that his ability to control the lateral center of mass movement improved. This group's probably not interested, but lots of clinical measures improved, walking speed, clinical balance measures, and most importantly, quality of life measures. He would come in and tell us things about how he can now keep up with his brother when he's walking, that he'd be able to walk in more complex environments, all highly beneficial things. And when he came back 3 months later, the changes that we saw persisted. And he was even talking about going back to work as an individual used to own a restaurant. But when we look at the mechanisms of how did he improve, if we look at during walking, not with a lane optimization, but just overground walking, we saw he had adapted shorter, typically wider steps. He was less variable. He chose larger margins of stability. These all seem to be high effort methods of controlling his center of mass oscillations. So overall with this, we thought this was positive, but what we saw with the movement amplification seemed to improve the capacity to utilize what looked like these high effort strategies to control our center of mass. So we were very happy with his improvements to interact with his environment, but we're really curious at this point, how can we teach people to use a more dynamic walking methods of controlling movement that might be more efficient and might not rely on just a wider base of support and really digging in. So I'll stop there, and this was lab focus, although only Em and I spoke today, but this is the rest of the lab. So this is just a couple projects going on, and